My guest this morning is Alan Chukwuhdi. And I love it because Alan spells his first name the same way I spell my middle name. But in any event, Alan Chukwuhdi is a psychohistorian who attended Fordham University, where he received a BA in both history and psychology. His journey in psychology began with organizational behavior and then quickly moved to clinical and research psychology. He is currently in the culture program at BGSP, the Boston Graduate School of Psychoanalysis. However, it was his enthusiasm for history, specifically African and African-American history, and the transatlantic slave trade that moved him to employ psychology and psychoanalysis. He is active in the BGSP Student Association 2023 and the APA American Psychological Association Division, DIV 39 and DIV 9, SPSSI, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, where he served as the Graduate Student Committee's the GSC Diversity Officer 2021. Moreover, he was the recipient of the NYSPA New York State Psychological Association's Roy Aranda Student Social Justice Award in 2020 and was the opening presenter at the University of Western Cape in South Africa towards a De-Colonial Psychology. Theories from the Global South Conference in 2019. He is interested in colonialism and, by extension, the coloniality of being, as well as the societal psychosis of racism. He is also interested in developing psychological interventions in Black communities that incorporate cultural solutions and using history to develop identity, cohesion, and the challenge constructed narratives. He is currently writing a psycho-historical account of colonialism in West Africa using the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah as example, entitled Kwame Nkrumah and the Language of Oppression, and a book on the Lacanian psychoanalytic notion of mirror stages. One of his essays, Storming the Capitol, that's what we're going to be talking about this morning as well, an exercise in the patriot right to violence, was recently published in the book Illmatic Consequences, the Clapback to Opponents of Critical Race Theory. And he's revising a paper entitled Hauntings, Transgenerational Trauma and the Unfinished Business of a Nation for the Journal of the Psychoanalysis of Culture and Society in his paper on identity entitled The Myth of the Black Indian. A collective fantasy is going to be published in Volume 1 of the new journal Psychoanalytic Inquiry. In addition to all of this, he is a producing artist that has numerous credits on stage, in commercials, and films. As I was on his website, I see that he was the first African-American to appear in the daytime television series Ryan's Hope. I remember Ryan's Hope. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Reading Circle microphone, Alan Chukwuhdi. Alan, again, good morning.
Good morning.
So, let's talk about my usual question is kind of like, and on your website, I see you actually have, I'm assuming that's your baby picture. Am I correct?
Yeah, why not? Yeah, sure.
Okay, so it is your baby. I just wanted to, so the reason I asked that question, because usually my first question is kind of like, where did this all begin? Like, what was going on in childhood? Did you expect to write one day? Did you had that in mind as a child to be an author, or is it something that came later in life? And then we're going to work our way and talk about how you moved from a historian to psychologist and so forth and so on. So kind of like, talk us through, like, where did this all start?
Well, I guess we're all influenced by I would say that we're all influenced by our history. And when I say history, I mean collective history as opposed to personal history. But I would say that a lot of the things that happened to me happened, completely by accident. But then looking back on it in retrospect, a lot of things seem to be preordained. And for instance, many years ago, I was just happened to bump into some guy on 23rd Street and Fifth Avenue, and we just started talking. It was an older gentleman, and he liked the way I talked. It was an older white gentleman, and then he turned around to me at the end of the conversation. I don't know, we got into some long conversation about something. I have a big mouth, so I was just spouting off the way I was earlier this morning. And then he said to me, I am a director, and I have a class where I teach actors, and they're all working actors. And why don't you come down? I think you would be a really good actor. and see if you like it, and if you and you don't have to pay anything, but you can stay for a little while, and if you like it, then we can decide how much you can pay. And I thought, okay, well, this guy, he's a little bit funny or something like that. But on that note of cynicism, I actually began acting because I actually did eventually go check the thing out, and that's how I actually became an actor. And of course, the guy himself was actually like he was like a psychoanalyst as well. And he incorporated some of that in his technique. So I'm saying that because things, they kind of really come full circle, and we don't see that until we look back on our lives in retrospect.
Exactly, and it all is meant to be. At the end of the day, we are where we are exactly, as you say, ordained to be. Because I find your path interesting, but at the same time, I'm not surprised because while I haven't gone that path, my path is varied as well. And so no one can really stay stuck. And if they do, if there are people that they stay focused on one thing for all of their days, that's fine. But then there are people who do different things, such as you now doing the acting as well as the psychology, and moving on and doing the historian and so forth and so on. I just think that just is a really broad horizon, which I think is wonderful in terms of living life.
Well, I always was really enthusiastic about history for some odd reason or another. And even when I was a kid, I actually, was really good in English. In fact, the funny thing is that I actually thought when I was in the junior high school that I might grow up one day and be an English teacher. I mean, that's a joke. That's what
well, that was one of my aspirations as well, but go ahead.
So, exactly. Of course, that's not my aspiration now, but I see they don't get paid too much. But but at any rate, I remember I was in the 7th grade, and I wrote this vignette. And the teacher was really boiling over on the thing. And then, it was like a skit that I was going to put on. I was hoping to put on for Twilight Zone or something like that. And she really liked it. But of course, all of the kids said it was too good. He couldn't wrote this thing himself. It was one of those.
Oh, okay. And, see,
but that's okay, because the truth is that I've gotten a lot of that throughout the years, because there's a tendency in academia to always try to downplay the achievements of specifically African Americans.
And that's exactly where I was getting ready to go. The question was, is that because of being African American? That's as soon as you said that.
Yeah, well, so that was the prelude to what I would be getting later. You know what I'm saying? But the joke is on all of those people and their cynicism who try to make out like I was a cheater and everything like that, because they can't be saying that now. But it was always interesting, because it was because I still get that to some degree. We have to give some extra scrutiny to what he said, because somehow he stole some of this from somewhere. And then it's they're flabbergasted. Oh, he didn't steal that. Is it possible that he could have written all of these things? And so, I don't think that in that sense that I'm that these are isolated incidents. I just think that that's the way African Americans are dealt with, especially African American males in a society, because there's a question of we have to make those people somehow lesser.
Right. And see, the reason that I'm as you're saying is because I'm, as we speak, doing some work on microaggressions and how it's innate, subconscious, and subliminal for the folks who are putting these microaggressions out there. So the folks who are now putting that on you because of you now being an African-American male, they don't, in many instances, may not even realize they're doing it.
Well, that's true, because these things do happen unconsciously. And so, again, you move into the history of psychology, which is why I got there. These things are happening unconsciously. I think what we have to remember is that when these people are engaged in these microaggressions, it's more about them than it's about us.
Correct.
It's about their own identity. It's about their own identity. They need a certain amount of identity cohesion themselves, and they can't continue to think of themselves as smart or superior.
Correct.
If they find that you have some kind of humanity or you're intelligent. So a lot of white identity is constructed on the fact that on the notion that, not a fact, just the notion that, the false notion that they're somehow more intelligent than the people of African descent.
Correct.
Because somehow we are still supposed to be some kind of animals. And so it's a question of them dealing with, how human is this person? And so we can humanize these people, but you can never humanize people that you're actually that you're impressing in some way or another. And in fact, we see a very vivid example of that taking place right now in Palestine. I mean, you can't humanize Hamas or the Palestinians if you want to engage in apartheid or engage in discrimination against the people. They have to be criminals. They have to be this. They have to be terrorists. And so, I mean, that's a constant thing.
Correct.
But that doesn't bother me as much. I think, for me, what I am most interested in is the fact that many of our people begin to then believe these very things about themselves. And
Correct.
I think that's the biggest thing.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, because as we were just talking a couple of minutes ago, in terms of how things go and are, and we can talk about this for a few in terms of how much do we contribute to the perpetuation of the very thing that we do not want to happen.
Well, that's right. Well, that's exactly what happens, and that's what you're talking about. Like, for instance, the system of colonialism. People try to say that that colonialism was over and there was some kind of independence. No, was no independence. It just took on different forms. And in fact, I would say now what we're dealing with is what we would call in psychology coloniality of being. So, you check on, the people after a certain amount of time, they take on certain habits. They begin to believe that, lighter skin, for instance, is superior, or the women think that, they have to straighten their hair and spend billions of dollars in doing it, over the year. So these little things, little things are in place. And so the oppressor no longer has to literally have a physical presence someplace, because they're still in control, because one is then made to believe that he or she is inferior. And that's a big problem. And I would say that it's much more insidious than something that is a physical than physical restraints. I really do believe that.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And when we were talking prior to coming on the air, I was telling you one of my favorite books is by Naeem Akbar with Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. I reference that book quite often. Matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Wade Nobles was on the show, and we talked a little bit about similar to what we're talking about now. Matter of fact, Dr. Nobles was talking this whole notion about being human as well, and he's a psychologist also. So we, in many instances, like you said, almost like the oppressor to a degree, could almost say our job is done because we don't have to do anything, because exactly where we want them to be, they're doing for us.
Well, exactly. And this is precisely why Africa is still in the state that it's in. But I mean, I don't have to travel to Africa. We could look at leaders, right? Our so-called leaders right here in the United States, and we ask ourselves, why is it that we are still putting up with some of the things that we're putting up with? Like, for instance, our young men constantly being accosted by the police or choked to death or something else, and our leaders are never really very forceful in these things, unless, of course, there's something in it for them, and then it's not that they're doing anything; they're just like putting on a show. I mean, so. These are really big problems, and I think again, it is a question of humanity. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. But I will tell you that this question of humanity and this question of psychology and how you deal with these things like coloniality of being and things like that is one of the reasons why I'm trying to promote cultural solutions in psychology, because we have to remember that every culture, the African cultures, and specifically that we'll talk about right now, they always have ways of dealing with people who had mental illness. And so, for instance, Freud didn't come up with the idea of dream interpretation. I mean, African shamans have been interpreting dreams for centuries. And Freud was and it's a fact that Freud was not only was he racist, but he was also he had his own Negro, because in fact he used to open up speeches sometimes with a racist joke about a black man. But the fact of the matter is that he was fascinated by shamanism. So I think that I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because I think there is some benefit to some of the modern academic psychology and some of these other things. But I think we also have to put in fuel those with cultural solutions so that we can build on things in our own way and in ways that make sense to us, black people, and you can extend that to Asians and other people too. So I think these things are very, very important, because I also take into account that actually psychology, the sciences of psychology, were also used as tools of the colonial enterprise.
Correct.
And this is why you have people right now thinking that we're somehow not animals, or that or we're lesser of intelligence, because these are things that come out of the psychological sciences. I mean, they literally had people that went in, and their job was to prove this, because once you prove that these people are less human, they're childlike, they're primitive, they're all these other things, then we don't have to feel so bad about ourselves for taking over their land, stealing their gold, they're raping their women, and so on and so forth. And we have seen examples of that over and over again throughout world history. And in fact, in many ways, that's resident in what's taking place right now on the Gaza Strip.
No, you're absolutely right, because I was saying a couple of weeks ago, in terms of the field of obstetrics and gynecology, a lot of the tools that was developed, those tools were tested on black women without anesthesia, without any type of painkillers, for the very reasons that you just outlined, that, they have high tolerance for pain, they're not human, they're not this, they're not that, they can take this. Exactly where, like, the stirrup and a lot of the other gynecological tools was experimented on with black women.
Slaves.
Yes.
Mays was the guy who actually did that.
Correct.
Dr. Harriet Washington has written a very, very good book some years ago on the very thing on medical apartheid. So I don't know if you've ever read that book, but I think it's a very useful tool, because she goes through the entire history of the thing. In fact, it received New York Times Awards at some time. So I think she wrote it in maybe the 90s. But I actually have a copy of it right here on my shelf. But it's a very good book, and it goes through the whole thing with Mays, because actually there was a statue of him on Fifth Avenue here near Central Park.
Correct.
And as a result of her book, women really started protesting, and black women, of course. But yes, this is exactly what happened. All of these things were black women were used for the experimentation to develop solutions to things that they weren't even able to afford.
Correct.
We still see that. We still see that in Africa, where pharmaceutical companies will get with the ministers of health and the presidents of various countries, like, for instance, Ghana, and they will go in under the cover, and they will test all kinds of medicine, do all kinds of trials on people in villages, and give them, a quarter, $1 a day, or $2 a day. This is what they do. And they test these medicines on people and then leave the country, and they do that in these places because they are outside of the purview of American jurisprudence. Because if they did that in the United States and somebody got sick, then of course, they would, there'll be a question of a lawsuit. So there comes a period in time in research when they do need to engage in human trials.
Correct.
And that's how they actually do this stuff. In fact, a fictitious movie that covers that ground is called The Constant Gardener, and that's actually what that's about. I think it's with Rachel Weisz and what's that guy's name? Ralph Fiennes, one of them. But that's what actually the movie is about. And then, his wife finds out about all these trials and everything, and they kill her off in Africa. But in fact, it's not so much fiction, because
correct.
It actually does take place, you see, and it's really, really sad. It takes place with the complicity of the officials inside specific African countries, and then you can always go into way out in the north someplace and find people who are so desperate that they'll let you they'll take a pill and let you shoot them with something and draw some blood later on, and and you can pay them $1 or $2 or even give them $5, and they think they're rich. And then you can just leave the country and don't have to worry about the after effects of what you've just done.
Correct. And see, as we're talking culture, and again, as I'm doing this work on microaggressions and social justice and the whole area, I'm doing some work in that area. In terms of culture and now, like you say, psychology, because one of the I was just listening to something last night about how, sometimes it's difficult for an African American to have a Caucasian or a white therapist or psychologist because of differences in culture, that the very thing that the African American may be trying to express is not received correctly, or vice versa. What the therapist is now putting on the patient may not be received, and because of culture, they cross culture. I mean, one of the examples they use is a Japanese woman or a Chinese woman, Asian woman is one of them. I'm not sure which one it was, but where they have certain values in terms of family and relationships, and they were dealing with a white therapist that didn't realize that culture, and so advised something that was counter to what was the culture of this Asian woman.
Well, yeah, I agree. In fact, that's exactly what I'm talking about promoting cross-cultural solutions. It wasn't just to, find cultural solutions, but also, I am a proponent of actually, for instance, an African-American, finding an African-American therapist, but the problem is that there's a dearth of African-Americans in the psychological sciences and in the psychoanalytic sciences. Of course, we're getting, more of our people are coming into the field now, but then, they're like me. They've become, you get swallowed up in trying to challenge all the traditional narratives in some of these places, because I often said, it's probably better, especially for an inner city black kid, to go to some African-American therapist. I mean, in some cases, because in some cases that's not true, because in some cases I think, because of class, that some of the people that I know could be just as bad as let's say, the whites. They could be equally as biased. But
right.
I think that the starting point of of people's social experiences has a lot to do with it, because our social experiences, in fact, do shape a certain way of thinking and feeling, a certain kind of psychology. I mean, that's a fact. You can't separate social conditions from mental conditions, because social conditions become mental conditions.
Correct.
If I'm poor every night and I haven't had food, or I can't feed my children, or I have to go out and rob, cheat, and steal just in order to put bread on the table, then I become a criminal, and then I develop a whole psychology around criminality. That's not something that I was born with. The social conditions, because of social conditions, I became this. So I think that's a very important thing. But the problem is that when you mention it, I mean, I as I often do, people then begin to say, oh, well, that's not necessarily true. So I guess the point I'm making is that there's a certain amount of work of getting, the silos of psychology to move the goalpost, But then again, that comes back to something that we was talking about earlier. Why we have to do that, why we have to stay within, certain frameworks in order to feel that we can function. And so another thing that I'm really interested in as a result of that is to develop for instance, an African American or Black psychoanalytic institute, so we can actually talk about these things. But
right.
But these are big things, because you have to move people, and even within our profession, you'll find people that won't show up to a talk about racism if I actually put the thing together. But if the American Psychological Association puts one together, then they'll show up, because then they'll be sitting in a room where there'll be 5 blacks and 95 white faces. So I don't know. I don't really, short of just saying that they feel a certain amount of safety in doing that. I just really don't understand it.
Well, see, this is, again, going back to the psychological slavery. I mean, and again, one thing I always have to preface these conversations with, because I know how it could be received, and I know that's not the intent, but a listening audience, and I always put this disclaimer out there in terms of these conversations that we're having is not about white bashing. It's not about bashing of whites. It's not about that. And yet that's the way it's perceived, when the truth of the matter is things are Europeanized, urinized, however you want to say the word. All right. So for example, for the example you just gave about, Hungry December, I can remember very clearly whenever that whole thing went down in New Orleans, when that hurricane hit down there, how the media, how they put the stories, let's put it that way. I was looking for the word I was looking for, or how they promoted it. Whenever the black folks were in the stores taking what they needed to be able to survive, it was looting. When the white folks it was doing, they were doing what they needed to do to live. So it was put out there in the news two different ways, and yet that's what's done all the time. Like, it's this constant, we're going to perpetuate, like you said earlier, that they're less than human. So now what the same thing that the black people were doing for them to survive was considered looting, but when the white folks were doing it, it was considered, they're doing what they need to do to live.
Of course, but again, you're talking about constructed narratives.
Correct.
And of course, the constructed narrative is not in our favor, because we don't control that constructed narrative, and a large part of that is our own fault.
I agree.
Because if you want to get your message out, you have to tell it from your point of view, and then you have to have your own organism where you can do that. And we don't think about that. We think more about getting a Grammy Award for talking about selling drugs in the neighborhood, or twerking on camera or something like that, and making some money so we can have a picture and show a stack of it, instead of saying, okay, why don't we open up a radio station? Why don't we get, open up a television station where we can then put our message out? Because that's what people do. But the people who have tried to do that during my lifetime, they've always wound up in a position where those who want to control the constructed narrative have done something to them. For instance, James Brown, if you think about his history, I think he was trying to buy a radio station in the South where he can control the whole thing. And then the next thing you know, the government said, okay, you owe us all this money, and you didn't pay all these taxes. And they got him on all these trumped up charges so they could take away his money. Bill Cosby wanted to buy a TV station. I forget which TV station it actually was. And then, look what happened to him.
No, it's correct, because historically, same thing with Sam Cooke. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, and on down the line. I mean, that's why, at one point, I know it was rumored. I don't know if it actually went through or not, but I know Tyler Perry was pretty much taking over BET. I think that's what it was. I don't know if it actually went through, or if it was just a rumor, but he was heading that direction, or has gone in that direction as well.
Well, see, but those things are done to put certain subliminal messages in our head, which is that, it's dangerous for you to do this. And so,
correct.
I don't care whether you're, standing out on the street corner and in front of the projects, or whether you got a suit and tie on, and you're, like a psychologist somewhere, whether you're the one African American inside academia, because that's another place where there's a dearth of us. And they seem to always hire foreign blacks, and it's a question of communication, I think. It's a question of how does this person understand what's being said? So I think, these things, even we're affected. Even people who would seem to be fixed up are also affected by these subliminal messages.
Correct.
And that's why, like right now, I'm hosting a series that's going to take throughout the year of speakers on race and racism from psychoanalytic perspectives, and it kicked off, at the Boston Graduate School of Psychoanalysis in September, and the next talk is going to be online, and it'll be on November 11th. But what I'm saying is that there's greater attendance from whites than there is blacks, and it's even easier to get like white speakers than blacks, and that you would find that to be kind of odd, but that's just the way it is. And I think that that's because people get aligned with certain things and say, okay, well maybe it might not be safe for me to or my position might become in jeopardy if I go in and I align myself with this person over here and start talking about this particular situation. You see what I'm saying? So,
I do.
So sadly, we're all affected by these by this kind of things, and it's really interesting to look at it from the standpoint of somebody who's in psychology, because you have to wonder how you can break that, because it is a really serious problem.
No, it is. As a matter of fact, that's one of the, as we were talking, what came to mind, because I know we're in the, I've always heard the term woke, but now it's in vogue to be able to talk about being woke. But that would be my question. Do you think more of us are waking up? And if we are, is it enough of us to impact anything?
No, I don't think that more of us are waking up. And I think that this whole group of, X generation and millennials who talk about this woke thing, first of all, I don't even think they know what they're talking about. That's just a fact. Because I don't see that at all. I don't think they're as woke. This is like another pop culture. There's just another pop culture kind of turn. They're taking it on that way, and there's nothing serious in the whole thing, because they are also the generation of people who talk about being woke, but they have brought into the capitalist enterprise more than any other group. There's nothing wrong with making money and being rich. I like that idea, but that's not what I'm talking about. We could never really be capitalists, and we have to start thinking about what capitalism has done to us and what it is continuing to do to people around the world. Okay? And when you look at something like capitalism or Kanye West or something like that, that's what they're telling you. They're telling you, what, we can be capitalists. And so the problem is that that idea or subliminal message is stuck into people's heads that this is the way to go, and you'll be rich, and you'll be another Kanye West. But the problem is that to me is the very thing that is tearing down our communities, because what you then have is our people then running around to try to fit in with other people, and you fit in with them by being rich because I can buy my way out of blackness. This is the thought. Okay, I think that's the underlying thought. It's unconscious,
right?
Which is not true.
Right.
But then they give up doing all the other things they need to be doing to build a viable community, because everybody's running around trying to make a rap record. So this trying to make this rap record, or it's like purchasing a lottery ticket. You know what I'm saying? You might win the lottery, but at the same time, if you spend $50 a week on lottery tickets, you might be better off thinking, okay, well, why don't I put $20 a week into a mutual fund?
Right.
That's right. At least this way, I'm going to get some kind of return that I'm sure of. But the other thing is not, and at the end of the day, years later, you find out, I didn't win the lottery that much, or only thing, every time I won, I spent the money buying new tickets, and I'm sitting here broke. You see what I'm saying?
I'm correct. I could not agree with you more.
Right. Everybody can't be a rapper. Just like some years ago, we were also told everybody should play basketball. So what you had is a lot of young men who could have been doing something else in their community. They could have been opening up a grocery store. They wound up, they died with hoop dreams.
Correct.
So we have to think about where these messages are actually leading us, and I don't think that we are thinking ourselves out of these things very well. So we're not very woke, and one of the reasons that we're not doing that is because we don't sit down and have community discussions.
Correct.
Anymore. And that's important. That's something that used to be famous. Excuse me.
No, you're right, because again, if you look back, because they did, the whole thing with the oldest survivor of the Tulsa massacre. She's like 106 or somewhere around there, and she has her book. As a matter of fact, I want to get her on the show if I can find her. At least the folks on the show, maybe not her, but her grandson or somebody. But she does the whole thing about during that time, that Black Wall Street, we were self-sufficient at that point. And again, going back to when that happens, how it gets torn down. And going back to what you were just talking about the hoop dreams, I told you before we went on the air, I'm the principal of an all-boys school. 99% of my population wants to go to the NFL. And that a lot of that is still there. A lot of that, the only way I can get out of here is to be an athlete. They don't want to focus on the education. And I'm constantly trying to help them understand, well, the education is going to give you options. Like, you want to put yourself in a position that you have options to go anywhere you want to go.
But more than that, they have to be realistic. I mean,
correct.
They approach it from a realistic standpoint. I mean, what percentage of our people actually become athletes? What percentage of all our people actually become successful rappers that make some money? I mean, I'm not talking about guys who get on the internet and say I did a rap record.
Correct.
Right, some $20,000 GMC car, which is nothing, because you can make that at McDonald's. You know what I'm saying? That doesn't mean anything. But also, too, going to school is very important, too, because one of the things that happens to athletes is that they start out young, but for instance, I fence. And I can see that now the club I'm in is actually attached to the U.S. Olympic Committee. But I see that a lot of young people that, their knees and everything after a certain amount of time, they just, not what they should. So,
correct.
At 21 or 20, the kid is in the Olympics, but at 26, the person is actually walking around already, sometimes using like a cane or something like
correct.
that, or have to wear like a brace on their knee, and because they have some kind of like a degenerative condition that by the time they're 50 is going to make them much worse. I could actually mention a specific name, but I'm not going to do that.
That's right.
On the air right now. But that's what actually happens, and so then it becomes very important that you can look down and say, okay, well, it was very important for me to then go out and get this diploma or get these skills or go to school for these business skills, because the little bit of money that I had, that I got from this, these Olympics or from this sports world for this short amount of time, and now I can go and open up a little store someplace, and I'll have this, or I can go into business and sit down and get a little job over here. That's extremely important.
No, it is, and I'll tell you why. Because my eye doctor, my optometrist, is a husband and wife team, and I hadn't been there in the last couple of years for my annual. And when I went back this year, I went back to where I normally would go to them, where their shop was. And when I got there, I saw all these boards and everything. I didn't know what was going on. And then I looked back up the block. They had moved down the block, and it expanded. And as I was talking to him, he shared with me how they took over the whole block. Now, they're both black. They're black. He and his wife are black. So now, not only is it their business, they've now brought in more optometrists to work under them. They went from Barnes and Carter to B&C Group. So now they have people working under them. They took over the whole block. They're now the landlords of the block. And I was sitting there radiant and booming. I could not tell him enough of how proud I was of them, because he was telling me, we went from 1,500 feet in the other store to over 6,000 square feet here in this particular building. And we own all of the shops, including the one we were in now. And so we talked about how leaving, now what his intent was, all right, we're going to leave this to our children. They don't have to become optometrists, but they have a business that they can run, they can manage, so forth and so on. We have to do that, going back to what you're talking about, these conversations.
Well, that's right, but I think that, now you're talking about, culture, and you're talking about community, and the truth of the matter is that we don't have but I would say Americans in general and many people around the world, the idea of community no longer exists the way that it used to, and so that is also something that is a strain on mental health.
Correct.
People don't have family the way they used to. I mean, there's a rise in singularity in the age of internet. Everybody seems to think that they just, they're an individual person and they can be whatever they want and change themselves into anything that I want. I was born a man and I'll change myself to a woman, and I was born a woman and I'll change myself into a monster. So it's a big problem. And I think it's a bigger problem for people in this country, African Americans, because you really need family and you need community in order to be to have good mental health.
No, you're right.
And so when you have community, you can walk around and talk about certain things and talk about your condition and have community forums. I mean, for instance, Malcolm X used to come out on Sunday and set up some stand or get on the ladder somewhere and talk to me when I was coming out of church. But that's because everybody was going to church, the family was going to church, but people used to get out and talk, and people used to sit around and talk about them. You found, in fact, I'm writing this book on Kwame Nkrumah, and the truth is that, he was in the United States before he became the first, before he created Ghana to a certain extent. And he talks about that, about when he was here, because he went to the University of Pennsylvania for a while, but he lived in Harlem for a little while. And he's talking about in the 30s that he was like flabbergasted because you could walk up and down 125th Street, and every place that you went on 125th Street in the black neighborhood, there was all these different street orators. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Talking about all kinds of things, and some of them were like really famous. So they, when you're reading some of this stuff, because they will be dressed up in all kinds of costumes or all kinds of names, and this is where the people in the community often got a lot of their information from. You know what I'm saying? And actually settled, but that doesn't exist anymore.
Correct.
See, now what you have is the advent of the internet, and of course everybody's on that, and a lot of the information that you get from the internet is suspect, and so what you have is another problem, which is the question of subjective, of objective reality. Well, objective truth no longer means anything. It's all about subjectivity.
It is, and you know what? That brings me, because I know as I read your contribution to the clapback of opponents of critical race theory, Illmatic Consequences, I see in your particular contribution, you talk about how the internet even influenced what went on there in a lot of these incidences during the Trump administration time, but particularly yours was storming the Capitol, an exercise in the patriotic right to violence. And in that contribution, there's several times you mentioned the internet. And we're going to read it. So listening audience, if you don't know who you're listening to, this is Marc Medley, and my guest this morning is Alan Chukwuhdi. And we're talking about a plethora of things in terms of especially culture, race, the contributors of like who is driving what. Do we wind up perpetuating some of the very things that we say we don't want? As you've heard in the last couple of minutes, Alan was talking about how, we moved away from community and moved away from family and moved away, and how much even that contributes to mental illness. But in the book, Illmatic Consequences, the clapback to opponents of critical race theory, and we've had several of the contributors on the show over the last year or so. Alan wrote chapter 18. And this is timely that we're going to be talking about this now, because his chapter here, this storming the Capitol piece, is a big part of all these various charges that were brought against 45. So let's shift to that right now, Alan, while we're here. Let's talk about, what do you have to give me your thoughts on what you were talking about with storming the Capitol and exercising the patriotic right to violence.
Well, yeah, I mean, who gets to talk about their trauma? Who gets to engage in violence and et cetera? These are political questions, and we know as African Americans that we have never really had the right to talk about all of the things that happened to us. I mean, and we've kept a lot of these things inside, and of course, that's why when I was asked to maybe submit something to this particular book, what I did was I understood that it was about violence, but I thought, you can't really talk about violence without talking about white violence. And I think that what happened on January 6, 2021 was like a perfect example of whites who felt that they actually have the right, a patriotic right to become a lynch mob,
right?
Because that's something that's also part of the constructed identity that they have.
That is correct.
There's no fear. There's no fear of the police. There's no fear of anybody doing anything to me. I'm going to get this somebody, but that is the black African Americans would not have even entertain the idea of like storming the Capitol, even though we have more reason to do that than any other group.
That is correct.
So, and I would also like to bring out the fact that we remember, I think the same year, a couple of weeks prior to that, a black woman with a baby in the back of her car took a wrong turn and came down the street down there toward the Capitol, and the police opened fire on her and she got killed. I forget what her name was, but that actually had it, and she was some kind of nurse or something like that.
Correct.
And she actually had a baby in the car. But that being said, I don't want to digress, but the thing is that you asked me about the internet, and we spoke about that, and I was talking about the rise of singularity. I mean, of course, being able to organize in the 21st century, that's been made a lot easier with the internet, and it's a lot easier with internet to find a global audience and to find people who think just like you or what you want people to think, so they can come together in group. And so the internet has influenced the development and maintenance of intemperate identities, and we've seen that on January 1st, on January 6th, because in fact, if it wasn't for platforms like Parler.com and some of the others, the insurrection of the 117th Congress would not have been possible.
That's correct.
These people organized online. But, if they're organizing online in this way, you have to ask yourself a question. Why didn't the FBI or one of those agencies who are very good about these things, because they've already showed us that with what they've done to the Black Panthers and everybody else, why they didn't go in and stop these people?
No, you're absolutely right. I'm going to read an excerpt. It says, and I'm going to read, the excerpts are not in order, because since we're talking about the internet, I'm going to read one of the excerpts on that. It says, as a result, the internet has given violent extremists a universal opportunity to engage with those who share their comportment and their misperceptions, call attention to what Horney, 1950, describes as neurotic claims. And another one is, on the other hand, an act of violence is also an erotic, this is going back to Freud again, an erotic transference. Moreover, a noose, Auschwitz, the Confederate flag, and MAGA hats all carry incessant meanings related to dominance. And then going earlier, in fact, the United States was founded on that psychosis, specifically the pillars of African enslavement and the violent conquest of native lands. Therefore, I submit that the definition of a, quote, good citizen, unquote, in American culture is a violent citizen who proves himself, herself, by actively excluding others.
Yeah, I agree, and I could have been more specific in saying a violent white citizen, because I think we're still we call ourselves African Americans, but I think the idea of American is actually a joke in terms of black people, because the African was never actually brought here to be a citizen, and again, I have to agree with Malcolm X even today. If we were actually citizens, many of the problems that we face on a daily basis, they wouldn't even exist.
Correct.
And that's one of the questions. Not only the questions from whites is not only are black people human, but are they citizens in this country? And they don't feel that we are. So if we look at the history of the United States, white mob violence has always, it's an exercise in community building. You know what I mean? Push the Indians out.
Absolutely right.
The black person, and we can look at historic lynch photographs as evidence of that. I mean, this wasn't just a bunch of violent extremists that hung some kid, which was often a kid, in a tree somewhere, some trumped up charge that maybe we might think he looked at a white woman wrong and he might have wanted to rape her. But I mean, people used to go get dressed up in their Sunday's best and come out with picnic baskets.
Correct.
By the hundreds, and then have themselves, photographs of themselves taken next to the hanging and burned body, and then some salesman would come around the next day and sell these things as postcards. I mean, you have to think about it. There's no fear of the law, because we're the true citizens here, and we're white, and so as such, we have a right to do these things. In fact, in our community, in building our community, and building our community means that we have to go out and engage in this stuff in order to be able to show the other people in our community that we're in solidarity with you. I mean, this is the societal psychosis here in the United States.
Correct.
And in fact, if we go to Florida today, this is why DeSantis and all these people don't actually want something like, Black history or African American history. Well, I should say American history, true American history,
correct,
to even be taught. Because actually what happens then is you have to talk about all of these things, and then it's very uncomfortable for them and the identity that they have constructed for themselves.
Well, this is my thing, and this is where every time, if anybody mentions DeSantis and Florida and book banning and all that kind of stuff, when they start using the idea or the thought or the excuse, for lack of a better word, that they don't want their children reading about that to be traumatized. And my pushback on that is always, well, how is it that the people that actually lived it? You didn't care about them being traumatized, but you're caring about your children reading about it being traumatized.
Right, exactly right. That's exactly it. In a world where they are an increasing minority.
Correct.
So that's another thing. So it's not their children they're worried about; it's themselves as well. Because I mean, it's a question of how do I feel good about myself? Right. Okay. And so we have, like, I don't want to get like too deeply psychological in this because that's not like really not that's not necessary. This is, I don't think your listening audience are a bunch of psychologists, but you have, it's something that I mentioned in my paper, which is the question of false self and true self. And I think that, we go throughout our lives trying to figure out who our true selves are, but in terms of false selves, we have more than one false self, and those selves are identities that we have constructed around ourselves, and it's very difficult to tell a person that, you're not that anymore, and when they're faced with concrete evidence that this constructed narrative about yourself is no longer real, they want to defend that with, they're violent. They'll defend that violently, and that is exactly what you saw on January 6th, which is why you saw Confederate flags. I mean, how could somebody possibly in their right mind think that the country's going to go back to antebellum days of slavery? I mean, why would you think something like that? I mean, I'm not talking about whether or not there is slavery, because there is slavery. Capitalism has enslaved everybody, including those poor whites who were storming the Capitol because they're wage slaves. But if you're thinking about like chattel slavery, that's not going to happen because, chattel slavery was very, very good for the early accumulation of wealth, but it's too rigid for industrialization. So, I mean, so this is one thing. So you're waving around this Confederate flag because this is something that that you've constructed an identity around, or you got some medieval shaman, somebody dressed up like a medieval shaman. These are all fantasies, and you have to look at this person and think, okay, what's wrong with this person? And I can tell you that you only had people out there, by and large, from a certain socioeconomic background, because people who are like rich whites, for instance, people who are considered to have normative whiteness, they wouldn't have been caught dead out there, nor would they be
correct.
Nor would they be caught dead living next door to some of those people who were out there. They might push them up to do some of their dirty work,
right?
But they wouldn't be, but they wouldn't be caught dead to be next to them. And in fact, those people know that there's a difference between them, and that's why they would never even try to get next to them or move to their side of town because they want to. Because this is why the notion of whiteness was created to begin with.
Correct.
Okay, because it was created during Bacon's rebellion, and this is and the richer whites told the Irish specifically, okay, you know what? Stop, don't come together with the Indians and the free blacks and all these people who are complaining. You know what? We'll let you have a measure of whiteness and you'll be considered white and the rest of them won't be. And they settled for that. They didn't get any food. They didn't get any more wages. They went to bed just as hungry, but they went to bed with their stomachs full of the idea that, you know what? I have a little bit of whiteness. As long as I don't walk to their side of town or get on their land or call them sir, I can only be slightly better than this particular person. Again, you're talking about the realm of psychology. You see? And I don't. It will take a psychological program in order to unmask that. But in doing so, you're going to, like as a psychologist, you're going to meet a lot of resistance because you have to make people see that you're not exactly who you think you are.
Correct. And see, it's interesting that you said, because I have a class on what you just talked about at 1:45 today. That's what we're going to be talking about in the class. But if you remember earlier on, I was talking about the disclaimer whenever I say this is not white bashing. Unfortunately, anytime we start talking about lifting ourselves or taking on for ourselves, that is the way it is taken. So when we start talking woke, or when we start talking, all right, building our own businesses, or when we start talking, no, we can't ban books because that's to let everyone know what was done, not just black people, not just white people, but let everybody know because it's part of the history. It is taken as you're trying to take something from me or you're trying to diminish me. And this is going back to what you were just talking about with that fantasy, because it's a fantasy to begin with. You're not as much as you think you are, but you've created all these. It can seem as if you are.
Of course. And of course, there's also another part to that. I mean, people in general, they want to feel good about themselves. And so, at anybody's expense. You know what I'm saying? I mean, so, you can't, even, Bumpy Johnson, for instance, who was a Harlem gangster, was running around selling all kinds of, heroin and things like that in the 1960s and, enslaving our people with drugs, was also a philanthropist to some degree.
Right.
I mean, he wrote poetry and gave to philanthropic causes. So the point I'm making is that, people naturally also want to feel good about themselves. They think of themselves as nice people, and I think this is the big problem with talking about this stuff, especially when you start talking about white people. They look at this history, they look at all these things. The United States itself has, and let's talk about white people first. They look at all these things, and they decide that, we're nice people because they think of themselves as nice people. There's been this constructed narrative that they're gentle, they're intelligent, they're all these other things, they've done all these nice things. But then they're confronted with this history of, okay, well, we stole land from the Indians, we killed these people over here, we raped these other people over here, and so, and we enslaved these people over here. So they don't want to talk about that because then what happens is that notion I have of myself as a nice person that slips away. Now, you have that also in the collective sense too, because the United States has all these things written down on paper that all men are created equal and all this other stuff. But if you look at the history of the United States and what it's founded on, it says something very different. You see what I'm saying?
Correct.
And that's why I've been to South Africa before, and one of the things that really that struck me like being in South Africa is I always think when I'm there. That it's really interesting because South Africa, I don't know if you've ever been there before, but it's almost like out of place within 30 or 35 years after the abolition of apartheid. It's at a place in 30 years or 40 years that the United States should have been out of years ago. So I actually think some of these racial problems will go out of that society before they will go out of the United States. And one of the reasons I think that's true is because the United States has all these things, all these lies and everything written in an American Constitution, and it needs to live up to this lie.
Correct.
And so it turns away from what's actually happening. And Joe Biden, for instance, going over and now proposing to give billions of dollars to Israel to actually promote apartheid in Palestine, goes to show you that nothing has really changed. And I think that black people, African Americans, should really pay close attention to this because it says everything. It says that the United States has never really given up its commitment to colonialism. It has never really given up its idea of apartheid. It doesn't really care about you at all. So, you can say anything that you want. You can be living on the street and things like that, but somehow they find money to give to Ukraine to bomb people or to Israel to kill more people. But if you're a black citizen or a poor person in this country, even a poor white, don't ask for any help.
Correct.
And I think that's another one of the reasons that the people, those people, stormed the Capitol on January 6th. I think that they have a lot of grievances. Some of their grievances are legitimate, but they've been made to think that all of their problems are the problems of people coming into the country.
Correct.
They're problems. They're things that have been created by BIPOC people.
Correct.
Which is not true. See?
Correct.
And then there's a certain amount of projective identification. They take the unwanted aspects of their own personality and they push it on you. You know, you're a criminal. You're going to do it. You're going to storm the Capitol. They're going to do this. They're going to take our jobs. Instead of sitting with the reality for a while, is that no. Just because you have white skin, the lie that they told you that you're supposed to be doing better is just that. It's a lie.
Correct.
You are a poor white person, and capitalism doesn't care anything about you, and you are no different than the niggers to them.
Correct.
And that is what they're really rebelling against. African Americans are not there because we've always been that, and so we got comfortable with that a long time ago. They're angry over the whole thing.
Correct.
They actually think that they actually think they should have more, or they should have better, and so they have aligned themselves with somebody like Trump, who's nothing like them. I mean, you can tell him all kind of rhetoric that he wants to tell them, but in fact, I mean, he's a rich person that is not anything like them. He's just using them. And I don't know what he's talking about immigration and all this stuff, because, when I was young, I actually worked on a couple of those Trump, like construction projects here in New York City. And I got to tell you, he was famous for bringing in all kinds of
that is correct
stuff like that. So they do all kind of work under the table on those construction projects. And that is how he kept a lot of his cut his cost on some of those projects, and that is also the reason why the unions in New York, the construction unions that are largely made up of white men, none of them came out in support of him in his presidential campaign. But, you can't have a rational conversation like that with some of these people, because, again, we go back to what I said before about, objective facts mean absolutely nothing because they have some subjective truths. And that subjective truth is all they're going to hear. And I'm just, I'm wondering how much that is influenced by the internet, because I don't think that people would have been taught this much up in subjectivity 50 years ago when people had to go outside like 3 times a day and get the newspapers.
Correct.
I mean, I just don't think so. I mean, we live in the Matrix to some degree.
That's right.
No, it's only going to get worse, but you see that taking place right now in this presidential election. I mean, all of these theatrics that take place. So it's very difficult for people, even for me sometimes, to discern between, the real and the fictitious. It's very difficult to do that, and that's going to become. It's only going to get worse with the advent of artificial intelligence. I mean,
Correct.
It's just a fact.
No, you're right. And I'm going back to the book because you were talking about this fantasy land. And I heard you say something about, we're good people. It says, this is significant when we consider President Trump's refusal to denounce the Ku Klux Klan when he said, quote, there were fine people on both sides, unquote, following the violent protests by white extremists at the Robert E. Lee Monument in Charlottesville, Virginia in August 2017. During the presidential debate in September 2020, he told the white nationalist group Proud Boys, considered a terrorist group in Canada, to stand down and stand by, quote unquote. In addition, prior to the certification of Joe Biden as the president-elect in January 2021, he told those who would go on to siege the Capitol, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. They're not taking this White House. We're going to fight like hell. That's a quote. If that's what you wrote, that was in your contribution. And then there's a meme here to what you were just talking about. It says, the meme says, here is the truth. Trump supporters don't measure his success by what he does for them. They measure by what he does against people they don't like. That's why they see him as being successful. This is why they will never abandon him, his tormenting of the quote unquote others.
Well, that's right, because in that torment of the others, they are again, you're talking about their own identities. They're aligning themselves with normative whiteness, even though many of those people do not have what's called normative whiteness.
Correct.
Okay, that's just a fact. Okay, then none of them is going to be his next door neighbor. They're never going to get invited to 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 dinner. I mean, it's just a fact. And upper class whites have always done that with poorer whites. And again, I use the example of Bacon's Rebellion. That was the first time that was done successfully when they created this notion of whiteness, and that's still taking place today. I mean, you can tell them anything because they want to believe that they have a measure of whiteness, and that says, okay, well, I'm better than these other people, because that's what it's all about. They don't want to hear, you know what, I'm just as poor as this guy over here. This is why all of these immigrant groups that came to this country that first didn't have whiteness, Irish, Italians, all Jews, all the rest of these, they fought like hell to get this idea of whiteness.
That's correct.
This is what we would call in psychoanalysis is an object. It's an object that doesn't even exist.
Correct.
People keep on grabbing at it. You know what I'm saying? Which is really bizarre. Okay?
No, it is because again, in the work that I'm doing, in the class that I was in, we actually went through the history of the census, and you will see different groups fall out of the census because they now became included in the whitenesses, like you were just talking about.
Right, and then once you become included in that whiteness group, measure of whiteness group, because they don't have normative whiteness. Let's be very clear about that. Okay, that's why they all had to live in their segregated neighborhoods as well, Little Italy or something like that, because they can't move, like to York Avenue and 70th Street here in New York City, because that's a whole different group of people. You see what I mean? Who are rich and so on and so forth. So, but one of the ways that you then solidify that identity is that you then have to go out and do something against people of color and specifically blacks, because that's how you can say, okay, well, I'm in your group now.
Correct.
I hate black people.
That's correct.
This is the problem with the police. For instance, here in New York City, they're largely Irish and Italians who are living right next door to us. But once you become that, now we got to go out and we got to do everything for the white society at large by criminalizing and doing all these things to black people. And I would say the interesting thing is that of all of the major ethnic groups in the United States, actually, African Americans are the only group that did not establish itself through some form of organized crime.
That is correct.
But somehow we're seen as the criminals.
Well, we're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but this is where the schizophrenia comes in, or whatever. I don't know, maybe I'm not using the right term from a psychological perspective, but this is the craziness. The very things, like, we're always called lazy, we're always called this, that, and that, but yet we were the people who built the country. We were the people that did all the work, and yet we were always the ones seen as lazy. We're the ones that did everything, but we're seen as the criminals, to your point of what you were just saying. And so... It's
called projective identification.
Yes.
You take the unwanted aspects of your own personality and you push that onto somebody else, and that's why you recognize it. See, that person is a rapist, but in fact, African Americans are not didn't go around, with this idea of raping white women all the time. That was something that was done. First, you got to have power to do that, and that's something that white men did in slavery. So
that is correct. That is correct. Now, one of the things I would always tell people is, if you ever listened to Donald Trump, I said, and I would tell people all the time, I said, whatever he's accusing of, that's what he's doing. So when he was talking about it's rigged, he's rigging it. When he's talking about this, that, and the other, anything he was accusing somebody else of, he was doing, to your point.
Exactly.
He was projecting onto, I believe the fact that he got in there when he did, that it was rigged, and he was trying to rig it again. But yet he kept on making this claim of it being rigged. That's because he was the one doing the rigging.
Well, you know what? I would say this, that that's probably true, but in fairness to him, I would say that he isn't the only person that has rigged the elections, and I think that black people, we should know very well that there's no fundamental fairness in the electoral system. It's been messed up for a long time. It hasn't done us any good. And the question is, why do we even participate in it? And I think this whole idea of Biden going to Israel really shows us, is a slap in the face to us too. You know what I'm saying? So I think that, I'm not getting into the deep politics of that, but it shows us certain things. There's always money for things for everybody else, but there's none where it's needed for inner city neighborhoods or or the police can come slap you down, and the government never really gets in. And if they do, somebody gets a slap on the wrist, like this thing I learned the other day about that kid. I forget his name, in Colorado, who they killed. And now the guy, one gets off, one of them gets convicted, but he's only facing something like 3 years. I mean, it's really ridiculous. But the point is that we've never really had any kind of like real fairness in these elections. Trump isn't the only one that has done that. But for me, part of the societal psychosis is, why do all these old men want to have this like stressful position anyway? I mean, why, what is Trump, like 80 years old or something like that?
Close.
Why?
And I've asked that same question myself, that I personally, if I got to that age and I had that kind of money, I would not be worried about trying to run a country. I just wouldn't.
Exactly.
But I couldn't agree with you more.
There's a lot of stress involved in something like that. And Joe Biden, he looks like he's going to drop that in office. I mean, I don't want to be smart, but I think that's what he does. But, there have been a lot of games played. Like, somebody who's not actually black is the only candidate that can actually hold that high office. But it's like, for instance, African Americans are considering Barack Obama to be black, but in fact, Barack Obama was a mulatto, and I heard him when he was running for president. He didn't even realize he was black until he came to New York. Which that doesn't surprise me, and doesn't surprise me either because he's from Hawaii and these other places, and I don't know if you've ever been out there, but people live very different. You've got a lot of old hippies out there,
right,
and things like that, and there's a lot of Japanese people and things like that. And if you're raised by white parents and stuff like that, how black could you actually be in a place like this? I mean, it's just a fact. But you could say the same thing about Kamala Harris. I mean, so I guess the point she, for instance, she's Indian and Jamaican, and all of a sudden she's never really been black. But once she becomes the vice president or is running, then she has to latch on and say, okay, I'm African American. I mean, because that sounds good for the narrative of the country, but in fact they're not. The problem I have with that is that we need to claim something so much that we then claim these people who then in turn don't really do anything for us. You see what I'm saying? So it's a big problem, and I'm mentioning that now to show that this idea of identity and like trying to be something, it's kind of like a two-way street, and it's not served us well either. Because I think that the people that we've latched onto and the symbols that we latch onto, like pop culture, it has not served us well, and we as a group of people continue to engage in behavior that has not served us well. And we've been doing that shit since, excuse my language, since slavery times. Okay? And again, you get into the realm of psychology. We have to start thinking ourselves out of some of this stuff. And we have to start holding people's feet to the fire. Or I would suggest that if we can't do that, we need to just go ahead and disengage. And maybe we need to disengage anyway and do what others have done, like just become insular and really start reflecting on some of the problems that we have in our community and how we are our own worst enemies.
Well, there you go, because that's where I was getting ready to go with you when you just started talking about holding people's feet to the fire, because as we talked before we even got on the air, some of that feet that needs to be held to the fire is our own.
Exactly. I mean, that's just a fact. That's why we wind up with all these bad things. I mean, you can say the same, but it's not just in the United States you can say that. I mean, the fact is that I'm in Africa enough to tell you that that's the problem there, too. I mean, people can talk about, leaders being corrupt and all that stuff, and in many cases they are, but there's also something wrong with some of the people, too. Because, I mean, they don't even think that I'm voting for this guy because he's from my tribe. This guy gave me a bag of rice and he came around. Some cloth, I hate that, that group over there, so I'm going to vote for this guy. And then there's all this enthusiasm, during the election. And then, a couple of months later, everybody's right back to where they was before that was the last guy, because they've got the same kind of crook and all of the enthusiasm burns out. And so this is African behavior in many ways that we brought here with us. And I think, we really need to start thinking about some of this stuff, because, it's what Freud calls like repetition compulsion, and we are continuing. We have been repeating a lot of behavior that we really need to examine and try to work out ways out of. But I don't know if that will necessarily even be possible without some kind of psychological intervention put in schools. And for instance, you're a principal at a school. I mean, why is it that we have to wait till like the the college level to start getting kids involved in like classes on psychology and stuff like that. I mean, I think, having groups like a regular class, like as part of a curriculum where the kid goes in and they start, you have like psychology mixed with group therapy and you're talking and things like that, in order to pass it. I think that's a very important tool.
Oh, I agree with you. Matter of fact, thankfully, we have started heading in that direction with social emotional learning and restorative practices and restorative justice. We've started going down that road because we at least in my building, I know with my guidance counselors, we weave that in. We weave psychology into it.
Right.
But that's not something that's in everybody's curriculum, to your point. It's just like financial literacy is not.
Well, that's right. And it actually, and both of those things should be. I mean, it's tough being it was always tough being a teenager or something like that. I mean, today's world, I think, makes it a little bit tougher because they're under a certain kind of, pressure that, I probably wasn't. And some of that could be because of the advent of television and movies and the accessibility of all these things and all these false messages. But I think it's very important. I don't understand why, those things are not part of a regular curriculum, and then maybe, as part of a college curriculum, you make somebody take basic psychology courses in order to pass. I mean, that would be a regular thing, at least for BIPOC, people. I mean, but I think everybody, not just for, people who are, of African descent and, Hispanics and stuff like that, because the fact of the matter is that the United States is currently in the grips of a mental health crisis. I mean, I travel the world, and it really hits me in the face once you get back to a place like here. It's like, there's all these drug addicts on the street, all these homeless people. I mean, I'm in New York City. This is supposed to be the financial capital of the United States. And you have to start wondering, well, what is wrong in the society that we're in that so many people feel that they have to, like, take fentanyl and things like that? Because that's a very psychological thing. I mean, no baby that, is born thinking, okay, I'm going to grow up and become a drug addict. You know what I'm saying?
Correct.
I mean, there's something fundamentally wrong here, and I think that, once again, the government doesn't want to face these things because it's a question of looking inward, and there's this constructed narrative that this place is so great when, in fact, many of its citizens are just like, they're suffering. Okay, which could also be the reason why, one of the reasons why it's so much easier for them to help people coming from someplace else, because they can look down and say, okay, well, those people they need help because they're like this, but we don't have that over here in this country. And it's very similar to the United States going over and saying, okay, we're going to boycott South Africa because of apartheid, and I'm doing that simply because I don't want to look at racial the discrimination and the race problems inside the United States. I can say to myself, okay, that happens over there, but that doesn't happen here, which you and I both know is a lie.
Correct. So I tell you what's next? Because at this point, we're coming down to the end, and what I do is I turn off the microphone for however long you want to promote anything you'd like to promote in terms of, like you have papers and books and everything coming out. If you're doing any book signings, any promotion, anything at this point, shout outs, whatever you'd like to do. The mic is yours for the next few minutes as we get ready to close out. But I got to have you back because I have just feeling, I don't know why, I just have this notion that you have a lot to say.
Well, yeah, what you're saying is I got a big mouth. And
no, I'm not saying that, because what you're saying, going back to... There's very few people that I've come across that I can have a conversation like this with. And that's a sad commentary, because more of us should be able to talk the way we've been talking this morning. And see, that's where it gets into this whole notion of, in some respects, we feed into, I could not agree with you more on that. In some respects, we feed into the very thing that's killing us.
Of course we do, but that's what happens to people over time anyway. And this is where, why I moved from some like history to psychology. This is what happens to people. It's really sad, but we see this throughout history. The thing is, I think that in terms of African Americans and specifically middle class ones these days, I'm not talking about the poor so much, because middle class people, they are part of the problem. You know what I'm saying? I think a lot of times we no longer have these conversations like we may have had in the 70s and things like that, because I really do believe that unconsciously a lot of the people a little bit more fixed up, they become very nervous about having these conversations because they're thinking about the clapback from the other side, and that in itself is a problem because what community functions like by thinking about what other people are going to do to us if we do this. You see, we have become very reactive people, not proactive people.
Correct.
Okay? We've situated ourselves where we're always thinking, well, if we do this, the other guy is going to do that. Don't do this because then they're going to do that. No, you have to do something that is good for you and your community. That's what everybody else is doing. But that's what they're doing in Israel. In and out of it. I mean, why are we not doing? I mean, it's a big problem because that in itself is a psychological thing. I mean, who thinks like that? Especially when the many of the circumstances and the people who that you're thinking about reacting to, that they don't have your best interest at heart. I mean, that's just a fact. So I think that's a conversation that has to be had as well. You know what I'm saying? We don't speak up and say the things that we need to say for ourselves. We don't. But a lot of that is also, generational trauma as well too. I think.
Correct.
We've never really wanted to confront white people the way we should be confronting them with certain things. And because there's a very different conversation. The conversation is very different when we talk with whites or others as opposed to when we get around alone and we talk to ourselves. And we need to be more critical of what's going on in our neighborhoods. And that's my greatest message. We have to be more critical. Kwame Nkrumah once said that, you should see the problems in Africa. Okay? And I see why. Because if you don't see the problems, how are you going to fix them? And as I walk around Africa a lot of times, people, just a couple of months ago, I had people arguing with me about how great Ghana is, although the first place the country is falling apart. Now none of them is talking that because they're starving again. But they was always there. So the point I'm trying to make is that not seeing the things that the things that we should is not something that started here. That's behavior that we brought along with us, and it's something that needs to be. It's something that we need to do. We can't have others looking at us and critiquing us. We got to look inside and say, you know what, we're not doing this, we're not doing that, we're not doing this, we're not doing that. We need to do this in order to build our community. I mean, this is a fact. I mean, why is it that everybody else comes in and invests in the stores and things like that in our community, and we don't even give that a second thought? I mean, what happened to black grocery stores? I mean, you go to the inner city, and the grocery stores are all owned by Indian people. They're owned by Arab people, nice people, but that's not what I'm talking about. It's like we don't even think some of these things are important anymore, and so in effect, you really don't even have a community because your so-called community is contingent upon all these other people who may not necessarily even have your interest at heart, and they may not even live in your community.
That's it. Well, I tell you, on that note, we're gonna have to do a part 2. I've had guests that I've done part 2s and part 3s with, and we're gonna have to come back because these are important discussions, and I archived them and I put them on my YouTube channel, and folks can get a chance to listen to them who didn't want to get up early with us this morning, and I get it. But folks need to hear conversations like we had this morning and reflect on them and then say, you know what, they're making some pretty good points there. And then once they get beyond that, they're making some pretty good points there. Now, what do we do to strategize? What do we do to tactically do what you say, build our community back? That's why I told you, and I'll end on this in terms of why I was so proud of my eye doctor, because they took over the block.
Right.
They took over the block. Matter of fact, where they are now, it came. I said, oh, that used to be the hardware store. That's right. They took over the block. And he was telling me how there was going to be a cafe, and it was going to be black-owned, a coffee shop there, and a couple of the other stores down the block. So with these discussions need to be had. So, no, this is not about you got a big mouth. You need to have a big mouth on this.
Right. Well, I think so. I mean, I think there's more we can do. And in fact, I would really like to see community forums, because in fact, I even tried to talk to somebody in our city council about, we can talk about that some other time, about, setting up these little things where you bring in and, bring people in and you have a community forum, you have these discussions, but they also will be like mental health outreach places.
Correct.
But then you start dealing with, politicians, and then of course they don't, Are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here. You're absolutely right. So,
but it becomes like pulling teeth just to get something done like this in the community. Or one or two will remain nameless in this speech. They jumped on the idea, and then they tried to put together something without me with my idea, and it didn't come off the right way, just to make themselves look good, and it fell apart.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, so it's really sad, but these are discussions that we need to have, and we need to have regular community forums in various places doing these things, dinner and a movie, bring everybody in, and so we can start talking about some of these issues, and because I think that, that's very important.
I agree with you.
And maybe that's
I could not agree with you more.
Work on it sometime in the future.
You never know. You're right. You're absolutely right. So with that said, man, I know it took us a little bit to get our date together, but I am so glad that we got it together and had this conversation this morning. I will be in touch with you because I'll be sending you the links, and brother, you can send them out and use them any manner you choose.
Okay, I thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Take care.
All right, have a good day.
You too.